Hey everyone, welcome back to my interview with Murray Smith. We've just been talking about the straightforward ways in which film and music relate to one another, and now we're about to get into the promised, more complex ways that they interrelate with one another. So here is part two of my interview with Murray Smith. So let's get into the more complicated relationships between
Have we not already done that, Brandon?
I mean, we're getting there. We're
We're
getting there,
getting
right?
there.
We've got. I mean, we've dealt with the straightforward ones in a very
Straightforward
deep
stuff. Yeah,
way,
yeah,
where we've sort of mined and
yeah.
discovered the complexities in what was seemingly straightforward, which is
Yeah,
doing good philosophy, right? But now let's look at
exactly.
the yeah. Now let's look at the more complex ones and help make them clearer, right? Which
Let's
is
do. We'll
the
do our
other
best.
way or another way of doing good
Yeah,
philosophy. And so, too, you mentioned to me over email before we were as we were setting this up is one film and music are both time-based art forms, right?
yeah,
And also they're both arts of recording, right? At least outside of performed music, right? Music can be recorded, films are inherently recorded. So like let's talk through those
yeah,
relationships.
yeah. Absolutely. So if we take the first of those two ideas, that both film and music are time-based mediums, and therefore, at least, let's put this as a hypothesis. Um, just as music, music's musicality, right, is intimately connected with the fact that it's a time-based medium, right? So that it has rhythmic potential because it unfolds in time, and it also has a kind of structural potential. So you can have musical motifs, which can be established, reiterated, developed, returned to. So all of those things seem to be kind of strong parallels between music and film. And I guess in my remarks, I'm just going to say something now to kind of mark something that I don't want us to forget. I'm sort of thinking in the direction of travel here is, what has music got that film might get by virtue of its similarities with music? But you made an interesting remark in our email dialogue setting this discussion up about the other, the reverse possibility, right? Right. Are there ways in which music might have a kind of filmic potential if we kind of think about the relationship in the other direction? And I do think there are interesting things to say there. But going back to the first idea, yeah. So certainly, yeah. Here are a couple of kind of ways of putting some of concretizing that idea. Um, um, yeah, maybe we'll do it first of all through the most one of the kind of most easily recognized, widespread commercial, forms of film musicality, right? And that would be the emergence from the 60s onwards of music videos. They weren't called music videos in the 60s, they would have been thought of as music promos. Um, and only with the emergence of MTV would I think they have been renamed and thought of as music videos, but we know what the practice is. And from that kind of point onwards, no, in fact, really goes back to the 60s. You have the emergence of a kind of sequence in feature films, which crudely put, you know, take the form of a kind of embedded music video, right? So it usually be something like a kind of montage sequence. In other words, a sequence which moves the action on quickly through a kind of a series of years or a series of months. It kind of summarizes a passage of action, or maybe it summarizes not so much a passage of time, but some actions which are all taking place in a given space, like the space of a city. But the point is, it's a kind of a sequence in a film which is um, a departure from the kind of progression of the action, in the more conventional sense, right? So it's sort of like the narrative progression and an ordinary narrative time is suspended for the duration of, say, a song, right? Um, and while that's happening, we're getting a kind of editing, a visual editing, and here we get to the musicality of these passages. It's like the score at these moments, instead of it playing the subordinate role of shaping our understanding of the visual action and the dialogue, it sort of steps forward and it says, okay, for the next few minutes, right, this music, and it's usually a song, this is going to call the shots, in a sense, right? It's going to kind of, at least in some respects, it's going to form the rhythmic architecture, right, around which the editing of the film occurs. So you mentioned Trainspotting, helpfully, in your very nice introduction, very kind introduction. And, that film is famous partly, I mean, it was far from the first film to have such sequences, but it is just a very fine example of a film which takes that kind of construction to a kind of, it's almost like this is a bit of a bit of additional theoretical terminology. It's almost like the constructive principle of the film is that many sequences across the film are constructed around songs in that way, right? So clearly, the songs have been carefully chosen to fit with the action and with the storyline. But once they've been chosen, then the material which has been shot and is edited alongside them has to kind of be made to kind of fit with the rhythms of the song in a certain way. So just to remind people of one or two examples from the film. So we've got Lou Reed's "Perfect Day," right? And that's a beautiful example for us to think about for another reason, and which connects with something you were saying, Brandon, a few minutes ago. So when we're hearing the Lou Reed song, which at least on the face of it is a kind of grand, slightly melancholic, but beautiful kind of ballad, celebrating a romantic relationship. What we're seeing in terms of the action, the visually realized action of Trainspotting at that moment is we're seeing central character Renton lapsing back into addiction. So he's come off heroin for a while. He's lapsed back into it. He goes to find his supplier. He gets a new hit of heroin, and he almost dies. So what we're seeing him get the hit, collapse into a kind of stupor, a coma, and then get taken off to hospital in an ambulance. And it's all a beautiful day. Perfect day, right? That's what we're hearing on soundtrack. So what is the song? How is the song working there? Well, of course, it's working in counterpoint. And I don't mean that in a strictly musical sense, right? But I'm saying there's an ironic relationship, right? So when you were talking about the role of underscoring, right, of the score in a film accompanying the visualized action and informing the way we interpret it, often that will have a kind of direct reinforcing character, right? But it can have an ironic character, right? So any experienced film viewer, not expert in some professional sense, but just an experienced film viewer, will of course be very well versed with that kind of practice, right? That here the song is playing an ironic role in relation to the visual action. Coming back then to the kind of the musicality of the film, then what I'm saying is that there are forms of filmmaking practice which give the time-based musical potential of film, they make it salient. They put it in the foreground. Those kinds of sequences in feature films are one space in which that can happen. But music videos, it's all, it is, that's what they are, right? The song is the thing, and a good music video is one which, in my view, is one which at once works with the song and kind of like gets you back into the song, maybe makes you listen to it afresh, possibly gives it a new dimension by kind of, some imagery it puts with it. But it is very much kind of like, the song is in some sense center stage, right? And even if the imagery is working in a complex, ironic way, it's got to be working in relation to in relation to the song. So
Yeah.
it's a flipping of the standard relationship, right? The standard practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. They're as you're discussing, right, with music videos, the video needs to and somehow enhance or reinforce what's happening musically. And there are plenty of examples where like the music video like can uh make precise the meaning in a way that like shuts down other interpretations. So one example I have in mind, and I don't know if you're familiar with this, is that David Bowie made a music video for probably, I guess, a demo or at least an early version of Space Oddity.
Hmm.
And it's a really weird, it's really cheesily made, it's cheaply made, and it pins down the meaning in a way that basically Major Tom is in space sleeping with alien women and he doesn't want to take the phone call from his wife, right? Basically. So, tell my wife I love her very much, right? It's like, yeah, just tell her, right? That's because I'm having sex with hot space alien ladies, right? And so it's like, oh, it's not like ambiguous in any way, right? In a way that makes the song without that video
Yeah.
interesting, right? Is this ambiguity is what the hell's going on with Major Tom? And then,
Right.
later down the line with Ashes to Ashes or before that, TVC 5, right? Like Major Tom's like gone through some stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely. I can completely see that. And I think that kind of literalism is a significant, um, you know, deficit, of a lot of music video making. I mean, more generally, my kind of stance on music videos is it's a strange old art form. I mean, it's kind of like, in truth, you know, it's a goddamn desert. Most of it is like trash.
Yeah.
Like, but there's fantastic potential there. So there's this kind of small body of fantastically interesting music video work, but all of this kind of really dull stuff that's out there. Now, maybe that's actually true of most art forms, that, most stuff done in most art forms is not bad. It's just kind of unimaginative, highly kind of routine. It's just routine stuff, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that's an unfair expectation or an unfair kind of description. But what I'm saying is, all I want to kind of put the emphasis on is that I think I sort of got into music video as an exciting area of practice around about the year 2000, when I noticed kind of that there was something like the auteur director phenomenon was emerging in the world of music videos, so that traditionally you wouldn't even know who made, you wouldn't even know who the kind of the visual author
Yeah.
of the video was. It was the musical artist, and we've said why that's so, because the song is in the foreground. But around the year 2000, you had people like Michel Gondry,
Yeah.
Spike Jones. There's that series
Paul
of
Thomas Anderson. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Um, um, and I for one would be unembarrassed about saying, yeah, it's great that we've got that small body of music video work where more adventurous stuff has been done. And it's not always strange stuff. It's just about often it's just about the care with which filmmakers, go about figuring out an interesting articulation of the song in relation to some visual ideas. And coming back to the trigger for this part of our conversation. So there's a very nice book, I think it's called Experiencing Music Video by Carol Vanellis. And this is, it might be an exaggeration now to say it's still unique, but certainly at the time that it came out, it was a unique book because it approached music video primarily from an aesthetic point of view. Like, what are the aesthetics of music video? Not kind of like, what's the kind of like, cultural politics of MTV, it was why do people like watching and stroke listening to music videos and MTV? What are the aesthetics of it, right? And one of the things that I appreciated in her analysis and that got me thinking about it was that a music video can kind of take you into musical details and sort of like make you attend orally to those details in a way that you might not tend to them if you're just listening to it, right? So you might have cuts, edits, you might have kind of shots which just kind of take you into, or shots which are placed such that they coincide with a particular beat. So, that beat becomes sort of salient to you. And there are more possibilities beyond those very simple rhythmic ones they've just described, but that's to convey the basic idea that the visual tools of filmmaking are being used to make salient some of the kind of musical relationships in the song that we're listening to. And when done well, the whole thing becomes what historically might have been called a kind of audiovisual music, right? So going back many decades, there have been kind of, experimentally minded practitioners who have explored two things. One is just straight out visual music, right? So that's the idea that there might be an area of artistic and aesthetic possibility which is like music but working with visual materials, right? So roughly speaking, I think we're talking about abstract imagery, but which is in a time-based medium, so it's film rather than painting. And because it's time-based, it can unfold in time, and so these quasi or pseudo-musical properties can do their work, right? So this would be filmmakers, like there was a kind of surge of this kind of filmmaking in Germany in the 1920s. Filmmakers like Oskar Fischinger, who came to America and worked at Disney, I think working on Fantasia. So kind of like that's where that one line of development, where that ended up. Walter Ruttmann was another filmmaker who made films of that type. So that's visual music. And what I've just described as audio-visual music is, if you like, the kind of less hardcore but still interesting idea that there might be a kind of an artistic practice which works with sound and image in concert with one another and tries to create a kind of a musical experience, but where the visuals are very much part of that. So again, one popular manifestation of this idea would be VJing. I'm not sure when VJing was at its height, but I'm thinking maybe 20 years ago. Right? Do people even do that anymore? I don't know. But you know what I mean, right? Right. So I had a former student, now very well established friend of mine, Mick Grierson, his name is, who who developed a kind of software called Mabuza, thinking back to Fritz Lang again, which was VJing software. So you would feed into the computer, um, film imagery, and musical input, and then you would be able to kind of, just like a DJ would scratch with turntables. You'd have a kind of like you'd use your laptop basically, and the either the mouse or the kind of the mouse pad. You use that to kind of scratch both the image and the sound simultaneously. So that would be a manifestation of the kind of idea of audiovisual music. But I think we should spend a little while on this has all been, as I put it a few minutes ago, starting with the idea of music and then thinking about how can film draw on those potentialities. And you had this idea that maybe it works in the other direction too, and I think you're right. So tell me about that.
I mean, it was just like throwing something out there, right?
Yes,
That,
I think the word you used
maybe
was
music in some
temporal.
way has cinematic potentiality. And I honestly don't know what that means, right? I mean, maybe something like, music concrete or something, where you could sort of work through like this audio space, right? And it can unfold similar to the way a film unfolds. Or, maybe something like psychedelic music was aiming for something like telling a story,
Yeah,
in an auditory way, similar to, the way film can tell a story. But there's musical precursors of this in the classical tradition, certainly with tone poems and symphonic poems, et cetera,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But that was just like, oh, maybe it could work the other way too, was like
yeah,
the basic
yeah,
thought here.
yeah. No, I think there's a lot to that, and it's far less well explored than the stuff we've been, the other direction of travel that we've been talking about for the last 10 or 15 minutes. So one way I have thought about the possibility that you're outlining here, um, I think there's a kind of genre of imaginary soundtracks. So these are kind of musical works which work on the kind of fictional premise that they are a soundtrack, except there is no film, right? So the reason my eye line was kind of going off in a different direction a second ago, Brandon, was that I was on my second screen. I was trying to find somewhere I got in my Spotify account. Let me see if I can find it. I've got a playlist called Imaginary Soundtracks, and I wonder if it'll let me find it. Yeah, here we go. Here we go. So what have I got in here? So just to throw out some examples, right? So again, the idea here is this is music which is somehow kind of inspired by or orienting itself to some kind of filmic idea, right? So we've got a song by Radiohead called Motion Picture Soundtrack. We've got Thriller by some dude called Michael Jackson. I think we know that one.
Yeah.
We've got, I seem to have all sorts of other crap in here. I don't know why I've got other nonsense in here, but Love is the Drug by Roxy Music. So let's dwell on that one a second because that'll kind of maybe clarify the idea a little further. So Love is the Drug, hit by Roxy Music, mid-70s. Keen Roxy Music fans will remember how this song begins. It begins with a little soundscape, which kind of suggests a narrative, right? So what you hear crisp footsteps across gravel, and then you hear a car door opening and slamming shut, and it sounds like a fancy car, like it sounds like these are heavy like well-designed doors. This is a German car, probably. but, but so it's sort of like crunch, 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 crunch on the gravel. Door opens, door slams shut, and then there's a kind of roll on the drums, and we go into the music, right? So it's quite brief. Um, and I can give you another example in a second. But the point is that it what it does is there's nothing in the song title, right? In that case, in the other ones, the song titles somehow evoke for you a movie world. In this case, it's something else. It's this little bit of audio rendered action, right? Which kind of puts in mind a narrative scenario which the song can then kind of build on. The other more recent example, and I'm sure there are dozens of these, was Jenny Was a Friend of Mine, The Killers, which I think with that begins with a set of sound effects. Is it a helicopter? I'm trying to remember. We daren't play it
Yeah.
because
We don't want to be copyright struck by YouTube.
right,
Yeah.
we don't want to anger the copyright gods of YouTube, right? Right. Have the wrath of those gods brought down upon us. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm just looking at other things here. Yeah, we've got theme for an imaginary Western by the group Mountain. That's the 70s. There's tons of this stuff. Once you start, once you um, once you kind of recognize the category, we've got exit music for a film. That's another
Another Radiohead.
Radiohead piece.
I mean, I feel like Bowie's Life on Mars is a cinematic piece of music that also is about like the power and importance of cinema.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Spell that out for me. I mean, the general thought is immediately compelling.
Yeah.
But the specific thing, the last thing you said is specifically about cinema.
So I
Is
mean
that
the
in the
song
lyric?
itself is about cinema, right? It's about a girl who's like, daddy tells her to go, right? For some reason, right? She's looking for a friend in the movie theater. He's not there, or she's not there. And uh she's gonna sit back and watch the movie, right? As a way of like escaping from the domestic strife with her parents, but I think also the orchestration by Mick
Yeah,
Ronson, right? Like
sure.
this swelling, sweeping,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
it
yeah,
ends
sure.
with the allusion to Strauss, from 2001: A Space Oddity, right? And Space Odyssey.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
was a good slip there. Um,
yeah, yeah, but a
and
good one.
so
I
there's
liked
like
it.
that, that it's about cinema, but it's also cinematic due to the orchestration, uh, in addition to, just the piano and the other parts
Yeah,
itself themselves.
yeah, yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Uh, and yeah, I mean, as soon as you evoked that song, I knew exactly what you meant um, in terms of its sonic and musical character. I confess, you know, this is a whole different discussion. Yeah, lyrics. Like I'm a kind of listener who doesn't track lyrics that carefully. It's kind of like everything else in the architecture of the song comes first, and for me, the lyrics are kind of part of the musical texture. And indeed, I sort of think that, well, there is, I'm not saying you are doing this, but there clearly is a certain kind of criticism. I mean, like, criticism, like critical appreciation of um, songs, which is wrong-headed because what it really does is it just starts and ends with the lyrics and pays peripheral attention to everything that makes it a song, as
Yeah.
opposed to a poem of some kind, right? Or some kind of verbal object. so so I've sort of come on a big journey in this respect of how I listen to popular music. In other words, I used to be kind of like probably a very bad listener in the sense that lyrics just were just too much at the periphery of my attention. Hence the not ever having properly listened to the lyrics for the Bowie song you just described. Um, um, but there was some kind of proper principle to that, right? About what is the proper place of the lyric in popular song, and it's going to vary with different practices.
Yeah.
So the lyrics are going to have different weight in different genres and for
I think,
different
yeah, in hip hop, the lyrics are much more important than in rock
exactly.
traditionally. I think that's absolutely true.
Exactly. But I think what is true is that to the extent that it is a form of music, then the verbal material will work differently just because it's part of
Yep.
this, right? Um, but yeah, that's completely persuasive to me, what you've just said about the bow example. One other example I'll just put in play here because it's kind of one of the most substantially developed. So Barry Adamson, who is probably best known as the bass player in, well, for many years, he was the bass player in Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. I mean, I guess it's probably quite a while since he stopped being bass player in the Bad Seeds, but he probably had like a 15 to 20 year stint, you know. And prior to that, he was the bass player at the beginning of his career, he was the bass player in a band called Magazine, who in Britain at least were a major post-punk band, late 70s, early 80s. Anyway, once Barry Adamson became a solo artist, he's really mined this tradition of imaginary soundtracks. So he has at least two, probably more than that, albums. I'm just going to quickly see if I can get this. Um, yeah, there's one piece called The King of Nothing Hill and another album by him, which I think is called Moss Side Story. And Moss Side is an area of Manchester, which is where he's from. So these are very kind of fully worked up, album length versions of the idea that this is, a soundtrack for a film that doesn't actually exist, with the further twist that there's at least one case of one of the songs written by Barry Adamson for one of those albums. And it's a song called Something Wicked This Way Comes, was used by David Lynch in the soundtrack for Lost Highway. Right? So, everything can move in every direction.
Yeah. Talking about movies, I stopped because got too anxious. That's another one that I don't think I finished Lost Highway.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
Another example came to mind as you were talking that sort of, I think, coming at it maybe from a similar angle is going back to when we were talking about music videos, when we were talking about directors who've gone into film from music videos. Paul Thomas Anderson, I referenced, right? Magnolia, his first feature film, the screenplay came out of Amy Mann's songs, right? She had written a bunch of songs. He sort of constructed the characters, based a lot of the characters and their relationships on characters in her songs, and that became the movie. And then, sort of the maybe climactic or at least like the emotionally impactful scene at the end. It's like the characters in the film are all singing along to one of her songs, sort of almost music video
Yeah.
style,
Well,
right? And
well,
so like that's another way that, the music inspired the film, and then the music is then in the film and is part of the soundtrack of the film, right? And it impedes on the film, right? In this non-standard sort of way, right? Typically, you don't have all of the characters sort of at their emotionally defeated moment singing the same song that's in the soundtrack, right? In the score.
yeah, absolutely. So I think you're right that it's partly that you know since the 60s at least, we've had several generations of directors who, among whom some are, deeply immersed in music. They're popular music people, right? And once in a while, you will get a project, where that, that kind of attention and love of recorded popular musical form, and that's maybe a good segue to get into the art of recording idea in a minute. That's so important for them that it actually finds its way structurally, into the process and the final design of the film. I mean, it's been a long time since I've seen Magnolia, but I guess it would also be fair to say that he's also drawing, and Paul Thomas Anderson is also drawing on some of the conventions of the musical film, the classic musical.
Yeah.
Not wholly. It's not like he's done a remake of the musical, but he's helping himself to a convention that's available from.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's a film that's not a musical up until that moment where it makes use of this sort of convention in the musical, right? So there's this interesting like genre blending happening
Yeah,
there.
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, here's another little example, which isn't in its finished form quite as, striking in that way as Magnolia. But it's an example that I happen to know a little bit, some detail about this example. So there is a film by William Friedkin. So Friedkin is most famously the director of The Exorcist. But about a decade later, a bit over a decade later, he made a film called To Live and Die in LA, which is a wonderful film. In the view of many people, it's his last great film. So this is from 1986. And it stars a number of significant people quite early in their careers, right? So it's got Willem Dafoe in an early role and William Peterson, the actor who went on to star in Manhunter, the Michael Mann adaptation. The first of the
Hannibal Lecter. Yeah.
Hannibal Lecter films,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So To Live and Die in LA has a soundtrack by a British band who were, I think, more successful in the States than they were in the UK. I mean, they had success here, but not to the same level as they did in the States. And that band was a band called Wang Chung, who had a huge hit called Dance Hall Days, right? And a bunch of other hits of a similar type. Now, they happen to be from Kent, right? So the land that I live in, the part of England that I live in. So I've sort of, I sort of know some of the people involved with the creation of this film, and it turns out the story is, Friedkin was listening to an album, I think it was the second album released by Wang Chung. So it's an album called Points on the Curve. He was listening to it when he was working on To Live and Die in LA, and was using bits of this album as so-called temp track. So this is kind of like dropping in music which you have to hand, which is roughly kind of giving you the rhythm or the atmosphere that you want. But the idea is just like a guide for your composer further on in the process. But he got so attached to this music that he eventually made contact with the band, said, "Would you like to do a score for this movie?" At this point, they're still relatively early career, kind of like, they're not super successful. They're kind of relatively poor young musicians living in England. And they get this big Hollywood invite, which of course they accept. And then what happens, just to give the summary version of it, is they do go out to LA, they meet with Friedkin, they end up kind of recording a bunch of original material inspired by the discussions, by the script, which is used in the movie, but the movie also uses some material, I think, which had, some of the temp track material that had already been recorded by the band. So, I mean, Friedkin is a much older director, right? He's older than, at least a generation older than Paul Thomas Anderson. But still, I'm saying that that's a kind of anecdote which kind of shows you how kind of like this sort of immersion by directors in, some variant of recorded popular music leads to them kind of like embedding it and working with it, working it into the texture of the film. And in my view, it's a very successful example. But shall we use that as a segue to
Yeah, please. Yeah, that works perfectly.
turn our attention to, so if we just go back to the moment in today's story when you said, Brandon, so we started off with the kind of some on the face of it sort of basic and simple ideas about how film and music relate to one another, how they're used in relation to each other. And then we turned our attention to two slightly more complex notions. We've talked through one of them, which was the idea that both film and music can be thought of as time-based media. And so there might be things that film can do that it draws from music because of their shared character as time-based media. And the second more complicated idea was the idea that they're both arts of recording. So the thought there is that, well, maybe we should say, of course, music isn't wholly an art of recording. But there's lots of types of music which have been substantially and importantly developed in the light of recording technologies, right? So one of my favorite books on this topic is Ted Grassick's Rhythm and Noise, which I think is a wonderful kind of exploration of this topic. And so what we're talking about are all of those types and genres of music for whom the act of recording is not just recording as transparently as possible some music which has been independently created, but it's the recording is part of the creation, right? So another way of putting this point, common way of putting it, is to say that the recording studio or the recording technology becomes part of becomes another instrument, another creative instrument. And I think this is absolutely central to large parts of many different genres of popular music, and indeed has kind of given us a kind of whole world of novel musical possibility and interest that wasn't there until the studio started to be embraced and used in that way. And I guess one of the the origins of this really are, well, broadly in the post-war years. So you mentioned musique concrète at one point. So musique concrète, just to give a quick definition of that, is essentially recording ordinary noises and then manipulating, reshaping those recordings into a kind of musical structure. But that's a very experimental practice, right? So one that I love very much myself, but it's a niche thing. So so my students always frown when I start mentioning musique concrète, because they know we're going into another rabbit hole. But but that practice has a kind of much more kind of like familiar, popular commercial set of developments. And I suppose you could, at least the shorthand, you could think of it beginning with things like George Martin and the Beatles, especially in the late 60s, when they start to really embrace what you can do with the recording studio. So, they're doing it all along, just in sort of the way you're through the recording of an instrument, you might be enhancing the sound of a drum, or the jangliness of a guitar, subtle modifications of things in the recording so that you can perfect the sound of this band. But up to a point, this is kind of like, it's the band as they sound live, and now we're perfecting it in the studio, right? But the threshold we cross is when it's like, now we're creating a sound which doesn't start with how this band sound live. We're starting with what we can create in the studio. And then as a next step, if we can recreate in the live performance, terrific. But that's not where it comes from. So an emblematic example of this would be Tomorrow Never Knows, right? With its fabulous, strange soundtrack of, well, it sounds like birds, I guess, but it's speeded up and reversed guitar sounds, multi-tracked, and that's just a very shorthand description of it. But that's what we're talking about. So those are some examples of how certain parts of the world of contemporary music can be thought of as an art of recording, even if there are, of course, many types of music which can't be described in those terms. But now, turning to film, of course, it's an art of recording through and through, right? That the film simply comes into being because it is an art form based on a technology of recording. So everything that I have just described through those examples, at one level, it's just what film does. You record something, sounds and visual events that were before the camera and the microphone. You take them off to a studio and you start to manipulate them, right? And the manipulation can be minimal, or it can be very, extreme and interventionist. A director that I often like to use to forge this parallel between some kinds of music as arts of recording and filmmaking generally is Jean-Luc Godard. Because at least his early films, I think it would be probably fair to say it's across his career, but certainly in the early films, it's just palpable, right? That you have this director who relishes taking material that has its origins from, things that happen in the world. So it's footage of actors in studios or on locations, but it absolutely relishes the way that can be reordered, shredded, reconstructed, destroyed, recreated, in the editing room. And for me, that has a strong resonance with the kinds of music that I've just been describing. So if you take a look at the first 10 minutes of Godard's, I think it's his third or fourth feature film, A Woman is a Woman, right? I mean, he's just delighting in messing around with the soundtrack in particular, right? So it's got this restless, disjunctive sound texture where, sometimes in the middle of a shot, sometimes in the cut from one shot to another, he'll be moving around from one kind of sound texture to a completely different one. So it comes across partly as a kind of oral collage, right? There isn't this sense of kind of like, as there usually is in most conventional films, of an effort to seamlessly integrate. This takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, right? What are the elements in a conventional score? Dialogue, sound effects, non-diegetic music score, and a sort of standard principle of sound design or conventional sound design is you're looking to blend these things, right? So that they all integrate with one another, right? And that can be done beautifully, and it's a very powerful thing. But of course, Godard, because Godard is Godard, it's he's not doing that, right? So he's tearing it up. He's showing us that these are the elements that you can put them together this way, that way, you and I'm not sure, in the history of film, that was a moment. It was a historical moment when it was possible for a director to kind of perform those particular gestures with a certain kind of novelty and force. And it's not that they have no value or force anymore, but they can only be done for the first time once.
Exactly.
you know, you know. So there is a certain there is a certain something, a certain freshness that those early Godard films have, which is remarkable.
Yeah, right. He's in a sense drawing attention to the standard conventions and
Yeah,
norms of filmmaking by breaking them.
exactly, exactly. So again, in terms of um, drawing out our conversation, making connections with the beginning of our conversation. And of course, this does mean that this might be a very convenient way of drawing our conversation to closure because we all know about that kind of form.
That's
Um,
perfect.
but yeah, absolutely. Godard is very helpfully understood, I think, in terms of a director who's, recognizing that there are these standard practices and um, by making certain changes, he's either he's either he's monkeying around with the contra-standard things, contra-standard elements, either refusing to include certain things which we expect, or throwing things in which are not at all standard, and it can work in both directions.
Yeah. So I think we'll end it there. You're right that this does have the perfect form of drawing everything back together in a nice, neat way. So, Murray, thank you so much for joining me. This was an absolutely terrific
Well,
conversation and
it
well
was
worth
it,
waiting
it was
for and planning out carefully.
well, thank you, Brandon, and it was really a lot of fun for me. It was a lot of fun both having this conversation. It was a real conversation. you know, I like the way you set things up so that we can talk freely. New ideas, examples can arrive to us, and also in the setup, it was good to kind of figure some things out, some territory that we would discuss. So let's do it again.
Absolutely. Get ready for the sequel, everyone.